the purpose of education, and for us, Jewish education is the idea about stretching hearts and minds, and that's why I'm really pleased tonight. I was gushing over Etgar earlier and telling him, like, I'm never starstruck, but we live in LA, like, what does it matter? Like, they're in front of us getting coffee. But I was like, you're Etgar Keret. So I'm really thankful for all of you for being here, for them to be here, and I invite you to enjoy our evening with Etgar Keret.
This is a true story. 3 months ago, a woman about 32 years old met her death in a suicide bomb attack near a bus stop. She wasn't the only one who met her death. Lots of others did too. But this story is about her. People who are killed in terrorist attacks are taken to the Forensic Institute in Abu Kabir for an autopsy. Many key figures in Israeli society have wondered about this practice, and even the people who work at Abu Kabir don't always understand it exactly. Everyone knows the cause of death in those attacks, and a body isn't some surprise egg that you open without knowing what you're going to find inside. A sailboat, maybe, or a race car, or a plastic koala. Whenever they operate, they always find the same things, after all. Little pieces of metal, nails, or other kinds of shrapnel. Very few surprises. But in this case, of the 32-year-old woman, they did find something else. Inside her body, besides all those pieces of metal that had torn into her flesh, this woman had dozens of tumors, really big ones. There were tumors in her stomach, in her liver, and in her intestines, but especially in her head. When the pathologist peeked into her skull, the first thing he said was, "Oh my God," because it was simply frightening. He saw dozens of tumors that had inched their way into her brain like a swarm of cruel ants that just wanted to devour more and more. And this is where the scientific observation comes in. If this woman hadn't died in a terrorist attack, she would have collapsed within a week and would have died from her tumors within a month, 2 months tops. It's hard to see how a young woman like that could have been suffering from such an advanced stage of cancer without it being diagnosed. Maybe she was one of those people who don't like medical examinations, or maybe she figured the pain and the dizziness she'd been having were something routine that would just go away. In any case, when her husband arrived to identify her at the morgue, the pathologist had a hard time deciding whether to tell him about it or not. On the one hand, it was a revelation that could offer some comfort. There was no point in tormenting yourself with thoughts like, if she only hadn't gone to work that day, or if I'd only driven her, when you know your wife was about to die anyway. On the other hand, this news could make the grief even more distressing and turn her arbitrary and horrible death into something much more horrible. A death experienced twice over, in a sense, making it inevitable, as if someone up there had wanted to make absolutely sure and no what-ifs. No what-ifs could have saved her, not even hypothetically. Then again, the pathologist thought to himself, what difference does it really make? The woman's dead. Her husband's a widower. Her children are orphans. That's what matters. That is what's sad. All the rest is nonsense. The husband asked to identify his wife by her foot. Most people identify their loved ones by their faces, but he asked to identify her by her foot because he thought that if he saw her dead face, the sight would haunt him his whole life, or at least what remained of it. He had loved her, and he knew her so well that he could identify her by each and every part of her body, and somehow her foot seemed the most remote, neutral, and far removed. He looked at the foot for another few seconds, even after he'd identified the barely visible wavy contours of her toenails, the slightly crooked, chubby big toe, the perfect arching of her sole. Maybe it was a bad idea, he thought to himself as he continued to look at the little foot, size 6. Maybe it was a bad idea to choose the foot. A dead person's face looks like a sleeping person's, but with a dead person's foot, there's no mistaking the death lurking under every toenail. That's her, he told the pathologist after a while, and left the room. Among the people at the woman's funeral was the pathologist. He wasn't the only one. The mayor of Jerusalem was there and the minister of internal security. Both of them made personal promises to the husband, repeating his first name and the deceased woman's name many times as they spoke, to avenge her cruel death. They gave a dramatic and vivid description of how they would hunt down those responsible for dispatching the murderer. There was no way of taking revenge on the suicide bomber himself. The husband looked rather uneasy with all these promises. It seemed that he wasn't all that interested, and the only reason he was trying to hide it was to avoid hurting the feelings of those impassioned public figures who were naive enough to believe that their vehement speeches could offer him some solace. The funeral was the second time the pathologist considered telling the husband that his wife had been on the verge of death, in any case to offset some of the uneasiness and vengefulness in the air. But this time, too, he kept it to himself. On his way home, he tried to think philosophically about everything that had happened. What is cancer, he thought to himself, if not a terrorist attack from above? What is it that God is doing, if not terrorizing us in protest against something so lofty and transcendental that it's beyond our grasp? Like most of his work at the Institute, this thought, too, was surgically precise, but it really didn't make any difference. The night after the funeral, the husband had a sad dream in which the dead foot was rubbing against his face, a dream that caused him to wake up in a state of fright and agitation. He tiptoed into the kitchen so as to not wake the children and made himself a cup of tea without turning on the light. Even after he'd finished drinking the steaming tea, he went on sitting in the dark kitchen. He tried to think of something he'd like to do, something that would make him happy, anything. Even things he couldn't really allow himself to do because of the kids or because he couldn't afford to. But nothing came to mind. He felt full of a dense and sour substance that was blocking his chest, and it wasn't grief. It was something much more serious than grief. After all these years, life now seemed like no more than a trap, a maze. Not even a maze, just a room that was all walls and no door. There must be something, he persisted, something that I would like to happen even if I can't possibly make it, anything. Some people commit suicide after someone close to them goes. Others turn to religion, and there are those who sit in the kitchen all night and don't even wait for the sun to rise. The light from outside was beginning to creep into the apartment, and pretty soon the little ones would be waking up. He tried to recall once more the feel of the foot in his dream, and in the way it always happens with dreams, all he could do was reconstruct it, but not really experience it. If only she hadn't gone to work that day, he thought, forcing himself to get up. If only I'd driven her. She'd be alive now, sitting here in the kitchen with me. That one. The second one is called Unzipping. It began with a kiss. It almost always begins with a kiss. Ella and Siki were in bed, naked, with only their tongues touching. Something prick her. Did I hurt you? Siki asked. And when she shook her head, he quickly added, "You're bleeding." And she was, from the mouth. "I'm sorry," he said, and started a frantic search in the kitchen, pulling ice cream trays out of the freezer and banging them against the worktop. "Take these," he said, handing her some ice with a shivering hand. "Put them against your lip. It will stop the bleeding." Siki had always been good at these things. In the Army, he'd been a paramedic. He was a trained tour guide, too. "I'm sorry," he went on, turning paler. I must have bitten you, in the heat of passion." "Never mind," she said, the ice cube sticking to her lower lip. "Nothing happened," which was a lie, of course, because something had happened. It isn't every day that someone you're living with makes you bleed and then lies to you and says he bit you when you distinctly felt something pricking you. They didn't kiss for a few days after that because of her cut. It's her very sensitive part of the body. And later, when they could, they had to be very careful. She could tell he was hiding something. And sure enough, one night, taking advantage of the fact that he slept with his mouth, she gently slipped her finger under his tongue and found it. It was a zip. It's a teensy zip. But when she pulled at it, her whole tziki opened up like an oyster, and inside was Jürgen. Unlike tziki, Jürgen had a goatee, a meticulously shaped sideburns, and an uncircumcised penis. Ella watched him in his sleep. Very, very quietly, she folded up the tziki wrapping and hid it in the kitchen cupboard behind the rubbish bin, where they keep the bin bags. Life with Jürgen wasn't easy. The sex was fantastic, but he drank a lot, and when he did, he'd just make her head and get into all kinds of embarrassing situations. On top of that, he liked to make her feel guilty for being the reason he'd left Europe and come to live here. Whenever anything bad happened in this country, whether it was real life or on TV, he'd say, "Look what your country is coming to." His Hebrew was lousy, and that "your" of his always sounded very accusatory. Her parents didn't like him. Her mother, who had actually been very fond of tziki, called Jürgen the goy. Her father would always ask him about work, and Jürgen would snigger and say, "Work is like a mustache, Mr. Schwiro. It went out of style a long time ago." Which nobody ever found amusing, certainly not Ella's father, who still happened to sport a mustache. Finally, Jürgen left. He went back to Dusseldorf to make music and live on benefits. He'd never been able to make it as a singer in this country, he said, because they hold his accent against him. People here were prejudiced. They didn't like Germans. Ella thought that even in Germany, his weird music and kitschy lyrics wouldn't get him very far. He'd even written a song about her. It was called Goddess, and the whole thing was about having sex on the breakwater and about how when she came, it was like a wave breaking against a rock. And that's a quote. 6 months after Jürgen left, she was looking for a bin bag and found the tziki wrapping. Maybe it'd been a mistake to undo his zip, she thought. Could be. With things like that, it's hard to say for sure. That same evening, while she was brushing her teeth, she thought back that kiss over the pain that pricked. She rinsed her mouth out with lots of water and looked in the mirror. She still had a scar, and when she studied it up close, she noticed a little zip under her tongue. Ella fingered it hesitantly and tried to imagine what she'd be like inside. It made her very hopeful, but also a bit worried, maybe about having freckled hands or a dry complexion. Maybe she'd have a tattoo, she thought, of a rose. She'd always wanted to have one, but she never had the nerve. She thought it would hurt a lot.
Thank you all for being here. In this really exquisite book, there are a number of stories that indicate that when Etgar gets on the plane and travels to faraway places, he's often speaking to half-empty rooms. So I think this is a relief for me, and hopefully for you also. I also think you're probably exaggerating when you say that in your book. But so thank you all for being here tonight. And I asked Etgar earlier what's off limits for this conversation, and he graciously said that we can talk about anything. So thank you for your openness and willingness to be here and share some of your wisdom and insight with us. Clearly, LA loves you. So. I think we should start where Lisa just led us, this unzipping narrative, because we both noticed as we read beforehand that it ends very suddenly, I wonder if you can share a little bit of the inspiration and what happens after the story ends.
Yeah, I think many times when I write a story, I feel as if it's kind of a collaboration between me and the reader. So I don't want to do all the work. I want to read it. Because I think that the unique thing about reading, unlike, let's say, watching a movie, is that you're very active, even if you're not aware of it. You imagine the voice of the character, you imagine the pace in which things are going. And I really, really like writing stories, for example, in which I give as few descriptions as I can, so the reader can imagine the character any which way he wants. I'm not good with lazy readers.
Are you suggesting on some level that within every Jew is a hidden German? I mean, it's...
No. I think that in each of us there's someone else, and that it sometimes can be a German with a heavy metal rock band, but not necessarily. But that we are many people. I think that my late father, when he survived the Holocaust, he had this sentence. He would say, "I don't want to live one life. I want to live many lives." And every 7 years, he would change his profession. And sometimes he would choose professions he was horrible at. But he would still insist on that, insist on kind of finding new things in him. And I think that maybe this is one of the reasons that I wanted to become a writer, because when you write a story, every time you can be somebody else, but being somebody else is actually always kind of being yourself, but you can just kind of sometimes set free sides that you tend to suppress, sides that can be beautiful or even scary. I had a reading event not so long ago where I read a story called Teamwork, and it's a story about this divorced couple, and they have joint custody, and the divorced husband is afraid that he lose that custody because there was an incident that his kid was in a playground, and allegedly a slightly older girl had bothered him, and that he punched that girl, the father. And when I read the story, this woman from the audience, she said, I really love your crazy and wild imagination, that you can come up with a story of a man that would punch a 9-year-old girl. And I said to her, what imagination? Every time I go to the playground with my son and an older kid picks on him, my first reflex is just to go there and kick him in the chin because they're just the right height, and then look at him and say, so how does it feel when somebody bigger than you beats you up, huh? You little piece of shit. And as soon as I get up, I say to myself, he's just a kid, and then I walk a step and I say, they're going to call the police, and you're famous, And by the time I reach the kid, I say to him, let's play nice, and then he does what all Israeli kids do and throws sand in your face and says to you, fuck off, and you don't know what to do. But the thing is that that you have this kind of half a second thought, about something that you want to do or that you push to do, and you control yourself. And when you write a story, you basically can set this thing in the open and see it. It's in my latest story collection. My wife says that it bothers her that I have so many stories about husbands who cheat on their wives. And
I wonder why that bothers her.
No, so I said to her, would you rather that I write about loyal husbands and cheat on you? It's just like the kids that, I never kick, there are those urges that I never realize. And when I write stories both about grown-ups beating up children or about husbands who cheat on their wives, somehow, without trying to be more, they end badly, But being able to write it is kind of being able to unzip myself and see those people in me and kind of let those emotions kind of play out in a kind of a padded cell, so there is no collateral damage and nobody gets hurt.
I love that, and actually, we'll talk more about both parents and custody and also about playgrounds in a few minutes, but I think that what you just said about your father and changing his career every 7 years is actually the link between Unzipping and Surprise Egg, the two stories that Lisa read for us, because what the widower says in Surprise Egg is that life is a room of all walls, no doors, which is really the opposite of the mentality that your father, as a Shoah survivor, sort of walked through the world with, like really having this formative time of his life when he's literally imprisoned, but coming out of that and saying, I will find doors, even when it appears that there are only walls. And in contrast to so many people who feel like we're walking in a maze with no exit. And so do you think that that's a choice?
So, I think Surprise Egg is a story I wrote because there was a dear woman, a mother of my friend that I really loved. One day in Jerusalem, she was very close to a terrorist bombing, and I was with her son, and her son was trying to look for her, and he called her, and she didn't answer, and he knew that it was just right where she was. And then he was able to get her on the phone, and we were all relieved. And a few weeks later, she died from cancer. And she was like, she was a member of the municipality. So when she died in a funeral, Ehud Olmert came, and and all kind of political figures came, and they talked about her. And it happens that maybe a couple of days before that, I saw Ehud Olmert speak at another funeral of somebody who died in a terrorist attack. And when I saw him there talking about her, I imagined how he would have spoken differently if she would have died in a suicide bombing. And so, in the bottom line, for a family, death was death and loss was loss, losing somebody. But it's so much, our life is so much affected by the story that we tell ourselves, So this is how I came up with the story. But this idea is that maybe, you can be in a situation, it's like my father, my father was an incurable optimist. And I always said to him, how can you be so optimist after passing the Holocaust? So he said, I grew up as a child through the Holocaust, and the bar I set to humanity was so low that they kept surprising me for the better.
Wow.
Which is also a story, which is also the way that you choose to tell things. And and my sister, she's a chassid, she has 11 children and 23 grandchildren, and lives in Mea Shearim. And I've been in her house when a water pipe exploded, and it took her something like 20 seconds to take all the children and dance around the pipes that blew and sing Shafte Mayim Besason,
Wow.
So I guess a lot of it is up to us.
Wow, beautiful. What you're saying reminds me of there was an elderly man who I became friendly with over the course of a number of years, and he was a survivor and survived, he said, many camps because he had one friend, and they were the ones who would pull each other out and save each other. And then they eventually made their way to the States, and they were business partners and friends for many, many years, I'm sure known to some of the people in the room. And one of them, the best friend partner, died a couple of years ago, and it was very sudden. So they were in their 90s, but he was really fine, and then just didn't wake up one morning. And so I called to offer condolences to the man that I had become friendly with, and I said, I understand that this came really as such a surprise, which must make the grief, complicated. And he said to me, surprise? There's no surprise in dying. The surprise is in living, right? And I realized I think that some people who have walked through that experience really every day wake up and say, my God, I'm alive today, right? Yeah. Let's talk about since we're on terrorist attacks, your book, really one of the early stories in the book is about how your wife goes into labor, and you're at the hospital right at the same moment that there's a terrorist attack, and all of a sudden nobody's paying attention to your wife in labor because they're taking care of all these patients who come in. And you share a moment where a journalist approaches you and says to you, you're Etgar Keret, aren't you? What happened? What happened? What did you see in the attack? And you say, no, I'm here because my wife's having a baby. Like, I wasn't in the attack. I can't give you a quote. And he says, too bad you weren't there. A reaction from a writer would have been good for my article. Someone original, someone with a little vision. After every attack, he says, I always get the same reactions. Suddenly I heard a boom, and I don't know what happened, and everything was covered in blood. And you say, it's not their fault. It's just that the attacks are always the same. What kind of an original thing can you say about an explosion and senseless death? And I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about what it's been like to spend the last couple of decades in Israel, where you were for both, the first and second Intifada, where you were, even last summer through these stabbing attacks. What is it like to be surrounded by death and to know that life always holds this kind of randomness to it when you leave the house in the morning?
Well, a couple of years ago, I was in the UK, and a journalist interviewed me, and she was very kind of British, distant, but as we spoke, she became closer, and at some stage she said to me, "Why do you keep living there? How can you stand it? All this senseless killing. How can you stand it?" And I said to her, "How can you stand this weather? Like, I wouldn't survive it for a week." And I guess I think that that there's something about human adaptability that we get used to everything.
Yeah.
And I think that it's actually a bad thing, because you can do nothing about the weather, but you can do a lot about the political situation in which you live. But when you get used to it so easily, and it becomes some kind of a fact of life, that wars are like biennales, fought on a biannual basis, then I think that people kind of don't do enough to change their fate.
Yeah, both my sister and brother made Aliyah. Oh, go ahead, you can applaud. Applaud freely throughout the evening. So my sister and brother both made Aliyah, and they were, they were both there during the second Intifada, and it was hard. It was hard. They were in Jerusalem, and every day there was some kind of attack, and we had many of those moments where we would call and couldn't find, and running around the house saying, "Oh my God, do we have the phone numbers of friends?" But one day, my brother was in Tel Aviv, and there was an attack in a cafe, and he called me very, very disturbed because a couple of hours after the attack, the cafe was all cleaned up, and there were people sitting and having coffee again. And he said, "I'm so worried about this." And I said, "But this is resilience. This is the Israeli spirit. This is how we survive in some way." And he said, "Yes, and this is how nothing will ever change. Because if we become numb, like we sort of aren't feeling anymore."
Yeah. Well, I have a silly anecdote. I don't know why I remember it, but I once went to Marseille, to France, and I did a radio show, and they brought this young French Jew to interpret me. He was very handsome. He was a lousy interpreter. He would even interpret the name of writers that I've mentioned to names of other writers, And after that, he said, "Let's have a coffee." And I sat with him, and I was trying to kind of figure out where did he get such a bad Hebrew, And we spoke. He said to me, "I made Aliyah," and he said, "I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it. It was so dangerous and so horrible, and I don't understand how you usually do it." And I said to him, "It's not that hard. Come on, it's not that hard." He said, No, it is hard. All the time, all these deaths and violence." I said, "Yeah, but it's okay." He said, No, it's not okay. And at some stage I said to him, "What did you do when you were in Israel?" And he told me that he was a pizza delivery guy in the territories.
Oh.
So I guess that's very difficult, when you make Aliyah.
For the record, neither my brother nor my sister was a pizza delivery guy in the territory. So we're going to come back this way, but I want to talk a little bit about Parenthood and some of your analysis. You have this incredible moment about in the playground where you're asked, I think it's in year 3, let me see if I can pull it up, where you're asked by some of the mothers, and so Etgar's like famous in the playground. He's called Ha'aba because he's the father, because it's all moms, and then Etgar's here.
I don't have a day job. Come on, let's put it on the table.
Because he's very lazy and unproductive in life. Is it like, how many books have we? So a friend asks you, so what are you going to do? Is Lev going to go into the army? And you say something like, he's 3 years old, I don't know. And it leads you to start to have these conversations with your wife about whether or not your child will one day serve in the IDF. And I just first want to thank you for giving us that window into your inner life and inner struggles, because we have a way of talking about Israel here in the United States that's really rather superficial. And even the concept of Israelis struggling with whether or not they would want their children to go and serve in the IDF, which is so much, the cornerstone of Israeli existence and the social existence of a child, which really, in the schools, the memorial walls, Yom HaZikaron, the way that children are raised in Israeli society, it seems like this is, the assumption and expectation. And to know that there, somewhere in Tel Aviv, there's a corner, a little playground where people are having this question, where they're struggling with, do I want my child on the front lines? Do I want to raise my kids to be fighters? Is very powerful. It's a gift, really, that you're sharing that with us, and I appreciate the vulnerability in that.
I want to say something about it. I think that, parents are the same everywhere. I think that, you have all those fairy tales when you have a child, and when you grow up, the evil witch will come and claim him, And I think that whenever we parents, we just kind of sit there trembling in the dark, waiting for that moment in which we'll fuck up, because we know it's going to come, It's kind of like one day there will be this damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma. I don't know, usually you want to buy a motorcycle, you'll go out with a shikse, I don't know. So I think that the strange thing about Israel is that it's so defined, that this moment is not obscure, you don't need any imagination, it's just there. And I must say that I was totally not politically aware before my son was born. Really, I thought to myself I was young. I wasn't, but I thought to myself I was young. And I thought to myself, there's so many things, and it's so complicated, and it's it's boring, and people don't listen. And the moment that your son is being born, it's like kind of a cent clock. That's how you say it? An hourglass. An hourglass. I'm kind of interpreted from Hebrew. So an hourglass that you say, I got 18 years to bring peace to the Middle East. Yeah. Time is running out, and I really feel like I'm saying, people would donate a lung, so the son will know how to play the piano, but they sit on their ass doing nothing as they see this kind of future getting closer and closer, and I'm not judging anybody, but for me, the idea was that, that I have to try hard, even if it doesn't make any sense. When I was a soldier, actually, I saw this film, One Bird Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest. And in this film, there is this scene where Jack Nicholson says to all the inmates there is a water cooler. He said, I'm going to lift the water cooler and throw it and break this glass wall, and we're all going to escape. And they all gather around him, and he goes and he tries to lift it, and he tries to lift it, and he tries as hard as he can. He can't even move it. And everybody starts laughing at him. And he looks at them angrily, and he says, you know what the difference between you and me? That at least I tried. And I'm saying, it's okay to fail, it's okay to be naive, it's okay even to be pathetic, but it's not okay not to try.
You you write that when your son's born, you want to convince him that there's nothing to worry about, that by the time he grows up, there will be peace in the Middle East, and he responds by burping and hiccuping. So,
and he started crying.
yeah, and crying. You wrote this this story. That's actually, this one's not in the new book, but you wrote this story about Lidor, and this was in the New Yorker, about the child who. So I'll give the background for a moment. But so the parents are divorced, and the father wants the kid to really love him, and so he takes the kid the day after the birthday out for special day with Abba, and he goes to the mall and says, like, I want, you can have anything in the store that you want. And the kid looks around the store and says, I want the cash register. And so, and the dad, and the Abba tries to convince the kid anything but the cash register, but he wants the cash register.
Yeah, and the kid says to him, mother always said that you promised me and
That's
never keep
right,
your word.
that's right. And so, yes, you're a liar, Lidor yells and kicks my leg as hard as he can, just like mommy says, you're all talk. So, so the Abba offers this young, teenage clerk 1,000 shekels for the cash register. And all of a sudden, within an instant, Lidor looks at me like I'm some kind of superhero. And it's so good to have, there's nothing better in the world than having your child look at you like you're really great. So the Abba is really fueled, like he's going to buy this no matter what it costs, and they won't sell it to him. And he offers 2,000 shekels, and ultimately they're escorted out by the security guard.
No, he starts bullying the kid because he realizes that if by bullying the guy and saying, forcing him to give it to him, he can win his son's love.
Right. So this is a great story. The backstory I read in an interview that you gave is that many of your stories are written in response to particular political incidents. And so I know that this is hard to talk about, but you said everything's fair game, so let's do it. So I read that you wrote this in response to the Elor Azaria incident from a year ago. This was when a Palestinian terrorist attacked soldiers in Hebron, and he was incapacitated, the assailant, and was on the ground. And then another soldier came up several minutes later. And shot him in the head. And this really, the soldier was then Elor Azaria was then charged with manslaughter. And it really, I felt it was really tore the country apart, that it felt like maybe 50-50, I don't know how much, but people had such strong feelings.
I wish it was 50-50. I think that the majority of the people wanted him to go out without a trial or any punishment. Yeah. So and the thing is that they all gathered under the slogan that he is the child of all of us. And there was something about this sentence that I realized that, it's kind of saying, who cares about what's wrong or what's right? He's ours. We sent him to the army. We don't care. He's our guy. He's our child. And I thought about it, that, that all my life I see myself as a left-wing liberal, and I I have no prejudice for people regardless of their ethnicity or religion. But when it comes to my son, I always have a prejudice for him. Always when there is a party, and I give all the other kids pizza slices, he always gets the biggest one. Somehow, So I thought to myself, this kind of instinctive idea, this kind of preference of something that is our own, is something that is difficult to fight. But at the same time, I'm saying, one could be a child of all of us, but sometimes children do something wrong and they should be punished for that. Mm.
So do you, ultimately, the Abba in the story comes off looking like a fool, right? Because the child is just totally manipulating the parent. And
I don't think he's a fool. I think that he's weak. I think that usually violence and aggression comes from weakness and fear, and I can, from that point, can easily identify with it, because I'm weak and fearful myself too, So I think that there is something about a father who feels that he's about to lose the love of his son and does something, whatever he can to win that, even if what he has to do is really, really immoral. It's not something that I can protect, but it's something that I can understand. And I think that this is really, for me, the role of writing. I usually, you know, if there's somebody that I find myself obsessively thinking nasty things about, you know, there's sometimes people, you know, I find myself kind of condescending them in my mind and thinking nasty things about them. The thing that I do, if I see that it doesn't go away, I just sit down and write a first-person narrative story in which I'm them. Because, you know, I always tell my students that writing and reading strengthen the weakest muscle in our body, the muscle of empathy. Because when you read a book, and you are somebody else, you know, and all our life we're just us, you know. And I think it's like, you know this thing that when, like you're in LA, so you know this thing. You drive your car, you know, and somebody cuts you, and you kind of pass next to him, and you forget for a moment that you're a Rebbe, and they say, "Who taught you how to drive, you stupid fuck?" You know, and then you say, "Oh, Jeremy, I haven't seen you in a while. How's the wife?" You know. So the thing is that kind of by reflex, many times we alienate from the other, you know. And this guy is not a guy who has life, you know, full of many thoughts and emotions and bad driving. He's just a guy who doesn't know how to drive, you know, and we wish him dead, you know. And I think that there is something about the act of writing and reading, that we find ourselves in a different consciousness, seeing the world from a different angle. You know, I sometimes volunteer and give talks for juvenile delinquents, and I once gave this talk, you know, to a group of juvenile delinquents, and like very early on, this guy who was about kind of 17, kind of got up and said, "I'm not going to listen to your bullshit." And said to him, "Why?" He said, "Because you talk about books. I don't give a fuck about books." And I said to him, "Why?" And he said, "Look, I only do stuff that, you know, that I get something from it." So he said, "I get push-ups, you know, to have muscles, you know. I learn English, you know, so I can hit on tourists, you know. What's the point about reading about people, like, you know, that don't even exist, you know, do all stuff that never happened, you know?" And I said to him, you know, whenever you read a book, you train yourself looking at the world from an angle that is not yours, you know. And I said, and one day when you want to hit on a tourist girl, if you know what she's thinking, you know, maybe it will work better for you, you know. So, so there is really something about what I get from reading and writing that somehow it's very difficult to get it from any other thing.
Oh, that so resonates. And I remember reading something from Amos Oz years ago. He said that sometimes he has writer's block. And so how does he break out of it? He starts to look at people walking down the street and starts to imagine, like, what's driving that person? What did they have for breakfast? Who did they sleep in the house with? Like, what's the story behind the person? And in this way, he kind of cultivates an empathy for characters, like made-up stories, you know, and it creates a kind of empathy. You know, so the San Francisco Chronicle says, if Kafka has the power to smash through the frozen sea of our souls, Keret perhaps can infiltrate our gray matter, adding synapses where none existed before. And that, right?
I know the guy who wrote it is my friend.
So, you know, you can't put words together like that unless you mean it, really. Maybe you can.
He's a good friend.
I don't. So, I think that the secret sauce in here is your empathy. I mean, it's a willingness to kind of dive deep into the stories and into the souls of people who we don't even necessarily look at or see. And I wonder, I mean, you know, you wrote a piece for the New York Times. Is it okay if we move? I'll come back,
yeah,
I promise.
We can talk
and you
about
should all
anything.
buy this book, multiple copies. He will hate to sign them for you. You'll read that in there. But he'll do it. He just won't like it. And so,
I like signing books.
So tomorrow, you're flying tonight to New York for the Bronfman Prize, and you wrote a piece in the New York Times about that when it was announced that you won this Bronfman Prize, and Mazel Tov, by the way, it's wonderful, it's great. And they're thrilled that you're going to be there with them. I spoke with them. The headline was, anti-Israel author Etgar Keret wins the Brownsman Prize. And you wrote this really great, I think very important piece about the way that we use language. And what I think is fascinating, I mean, now and has been for the last decades, but it feels like it's building and building, is the way that we Zionists in America judge Israelis who are actually in the fight every day, battling for civil society, for human rights, for pathways to peace, but you're not Zionist enough for my Zionism here in LA. And it feels, thank you. I'll tell you where to address the hate mail later. So, what's so powerful is the way that you write and the way that you think about this conflict seems to me that it has the capacity to transform the conflict. And what's so worrying for me is when people stop listening. And then I wonder where does this end, right? So if we can't hear voices like yours, I'm sure you know that Achinoam Nini, that Noah, the great Israeli singer, just had this, in a move that I think is actually really catastrophic for the Jewish community. They a synagogue in Detroit just canceled her concert because she's not Zionist enough. Israeli Jewish singer who's lived her whole life in Israel. Because they said that they could not ensure enough security and enough protection for her and others there, because there were right-wing folks who were very upset about her politics, because she is anti-BDS and she is she's pro-two-state solution and pro-peace and pro-Israel, but she's willing to sing with Palestinians about their shared hope for peace, and she's willing to show up at a parent circle event. And talk about what our shared dreams are. Can you reflect for a moment about what it means to sit in that?
I want to say something. You kind of put this difference. You said that you lived all your life in Israel, and I think the subtext was that you didn't, or people here didn't. And I want to say something about the way that I see the Jewish-American relationship and the Israeli one. I really think. I once met this guy who was in some kind of a Zionist, something like those guys who go overseas and ask people to give them donation for the Keren Kayemet. I don't know how you call those people. Schnorrels? Okay. So I asked him, he took me out for dinner, and I asked him, what's your job? He said, it's very easy. He said, I go to rich people's houses. I say to them, write me a check for Israel. Then they write me a check. I take the check. I pretend that I look at it, but I don't really look at it. I rip it to pieces, and I said, have you no shame? Have you no shame? My son lies down outside of Gaza, while your son is learning in Rutgers and Princeton, and you write this check. I saw the swimming pool outside. Write me another check. And he says, and they write double. He said, basically, what I work is kind of a BDSM kind of thing, I kind of whips them, and they give me money. And I think really, and I think that it all kind of comes down to this kind of thing, that the story of the two brothers, one went to Israel, one went to the States. 40 years later, probably if they were smart, the one in the US makes more money, okay? The one in the US didn't lose anybody in his family in a war. People are not post-traumatic or anything. And there is some kind of a guilt there, a guilt that I think that is many times being exploited. But I think that, that nobody should feel guilty for his legitimate choices. I think that Jewish Americans who care about Israel and support Israel are, as good people, are good people. I prefer them on bad people living in my country. I don't really think that they have less of a standing to say what they think about. I think that, many times people say to the Jewish Americans, how can you criticize Israel when your son is not in the army? And I say, for me, criticizing is a way of love. If I go in the street, really, if I see somebody shooting heroin in the street, I move to the other sidewalk. If I see somebody I care about shooting in the street, I say, oh my God, what are you doing, man? And I think that, the responsibility of American Jewry is not to support Israel, but to be the best and smartest partner for Israel, to support what they like, to stand against what they don't like, and not to be in this kind of unconditional position because they are lucky enough to live in a place that is not in a conflict, that their children are not in danger. You know, and I think that, and I feel that the same people who delegitimize criticism, of American Jewry are the same people who criticize and delegitimize criticism for me. We also have those kind of people say, love it or leave it. I live with my wife. I don't want to leave her, but she gets on my nerves. So I say to her, please don't do that. It's what people do when they are in a relationship. It's not, Israel is not a given. We don't have a king that we stay in this position until he dies, even though sometimes he thinks that he's staying in this position for you. And I'm saying everybody who lives in democracy or outside of democracy, everybody who cares about something should take this care and say something and try to make the world and the things that he cares about better.
Thank you. So a couple of years ago, during the Gaza war in the summer of 2014, you had a correspondence with Sayed Kashua, great Israeli Arab writer, who for many years was writing for Haaretz and living in Jerusalem, and then moved to Illinois. To
Urbana, Illinois. I've been there.
Urbana, Illinois.
What a change.
And you were both gracious enough to allow the New Yorker to publish the correspondence. And I wonder if you'd be willing to read. I'll set it up would you?
Yeah,
okay. So let me preface this by saying that Etgar has never read this out loud before, and it's in translation, obviously. So, so basically, Sayed Kashua is talking about how painful it is for him to essentially, to be living in the United States and getting used to how cold it is in Illinois,
and he left because he felt threatened and his children had suffered violence. He studied in a Arabic Israeli school that was burnt down as a hate crime,
So he said, so he wrote to you, this summer I realized that I lost. He says he was fighting his whole life as an Arab Israeli, writing in Hebrew, every week to try to get Israelis to understand, to get Israeli Jews to understand Israeli Arabs. And he said, this summer I realized that I'd lost. This summer, the last vestiges of hope in my heart were crushed. This summer, I realized I couldn't lie to my kids anymore and tell them that one day they'd have equal rights in a democratic country. This summer, I realized that Arab citizens of the country would never have a better future. And he writes to you as his friend and says, tell me a story, Etgar, make me feel better. And you wrote the following story. So I would love if you would share this with us.
Yes, I just want to say again, that I wrote it, like he wrote an email and I answered that email. So it's not kind of like a fully edited story, just something
It's really good.
Okay.
It's a really good story.
Yeah, so he asked for a hopeful story. So it goes like this. 2015 was a historic year in the Middle East, all because of a surprising, brilliant idea that an Arab Israeli expatriate had. One evening, the writer was sitting on his front porch in Urbana, Illinois, looking at the endless cornfields that spread all the way to the horizon. Seeing that enormous expanse, he couldn't escape the thought that maybe the troubles in the place he came from stemmed from the fact that there simply wasn't enough room for everybody. If I could just pack all those fields in my suitcase, he said to himself, fold them very, very neatly, very, very small, I could fly back to Israel with them. I'd pass through the customs on the green line for people who have nothing to declare, because what would I really have? It wasn't as if I'd be bringing some subversive ideology in my suitcase or anything else that might interest the custom inspector. All I would have would be some huge cornfields that I'd folded up very, very small. And when I got home, I'd open the suitcase, take them out, and shazam! All of a sudden, there would be enough land for everyone, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and even some left over for a giant amusement park where both people would take all the knowledge and technology that they apply to developing weapons and use it to build the most amazing roller coaster in the world instead. He was very excited when he went into the house and tried to share his thrilling insight with his wife, but she refused to get excited. Forget it, she said in a cold voice.
It will never work. The writer admitted that he still had to figure out a number of logistic issues, like convincing the farmers in Illinois to give him all those cornfields, not to mention finding a method of folding them that would allow them to squeeze all those fields into a large suitcase. But he rebuked his wife. Those minor problems are no reason to abandon an idea that might bring peace to our region. That's not the problem, dummy, his wife said. Even if you manage to squeeze all the land in the world into that battered suitcase of yours, you'd never succeed in bringing peace to the region. No, on one hand, the radical ultra-Orthodox would say that God promised all those cornfields to them. And on the other, the Messianic racists would say that those cornfields were their birthright. There's no getting away from it, husband, she said, shrugging. We were born in a place where even though a lot of people want to live side by side in peace, there are still enough people on both sides who don't want to, and they'll never let it happen. That night, the writer had a strange dream, and in it, there was an endless cornfield, and from that cornfield, missiles were being launched and shot down by anti-missiles missiles as jet fighters flew past, dropping bombs from the heavens. The field went up in flame, and the writer found himself wondering, still in his dream, who the hell was fighting whom? Because there were no people at all in the dream, just missiles, bombs, and burning cobs of corn. The next morning, the writer drank his disgusting American coffee quietly, without even saying good morning to his wife. He was highly insulted that she had called him a dummy the day before. And after dropping the kids off at school in kindergarten, he sat down at his computer and tried to write a story. Something said, with a lot of self-pity, about an honest, good man whose life and wife had both been cruel to him for no reason. But as he labored over the story, a brilliant idea popped into his head, 100 times better than the previous one, about how to solve the problems of the Middle East. If the issue wasn't territory but people, all they had to do was to update the two-state solution to a three-state solution, so that the Palestinians would live in the first, the Israelis in the second, and the radical fundamentalists, the racists, and all those people who just get the kick out of fighting each other would live in the third. His wife was less scornful of this plan than she had been of his folding up the cornfields idea. Not to mention that Barack Obama, whom the writer bumped into in a diner at a gas station on the outskirts of Urbana, Illinois, simply loved it. In less than a decade, there were 3 countries side by side in that tiny corner of the Middle East: the State of Israel, the State of Palestine, and the Republic of force is the only language they understand. A place where civil war raged constantly and which arms dealers and news broadcasters supported. The writer, who in the story is quite modest, politely refused the Nobel Peace Prize, packed his suitcase, and went back with his family to his old house in Israel. And each time Barack Obama came to the Middle East in another one of his unsuccessful efforts to bring peace to the Republic of force is the only language they understand, he'd stop in for a visit to the writer who had managed with his own hands to bring peace to his people. They'd sit together in silence on the writer's balcony, which overlooked a terraced valley, and eat heartily of the ears of corn resting on the plates in front of them. The truth is, like, I get emotional when I read it because I think of Syed. I really wish he would be with us, but I totally understand him. But it's really...
Well,
yeah.
I think this is
You know what I said to him when he left? I said to him, it always made me feel safe when you were around, because now all those people who were out for your blood, they'll go for mine. So you were like my human shield. Yeah.
This is, I think this is what your friend meant when he said that you're adding synapses to the brain. So the 3-state solution.
I often say in interviews, and actually Israelis don't like it when I say it, that I feel more Jewish than Israel, because like I live in Israel and I hope I live all my life in Israel, but I can imagine myself not living in Israel. I can't imagine myself stop being Jewish. And I think that, there is something about Judaism, like words like love or postmodernism or God, I think everybody can interpret it in a different way. But I think that there are so many things that I like in Judaism. It's actually whenever I have a kind of arguments, with people who disagree with me politically and they get heated and they say, people like you should be killed or driven out of the country. I say to them, look, we come from a religion where think about, let's say, Abraham, Moses, Jonah, Job. The one thing that they had in common is they all argued with God, and God could take it. So you can take an argument, and I really think that we come from from a religion that believes that you learn through polemic, that you learn in chavruta by arguing to each other. You're always allowed to challenge ideas, and you're always allowed. And we live in a society where you're asked to reflect, and to self-criticize yourself. When Naftali Bennett's party, they ran under the slogan in the last election, from now on we stop apologizing. And I said, so what, we're going to cancel Yom Kippur? So what is a Jew that cannot apologize? What is a Jew that cannot take responsibility for things that he did that are wrong? Up until this day, when Yom Kippur comes, I always have at least one phone call to make and to say sorry to somebody. So I fundamentally see myself as Jewish. I have a plane to catch as a good wandering Jew, so I won't keep on going on and on with that. But there are so many things in me that that I feel that I can define them in no other way but say that they're Jewish.
What is the first story that you ever wrote?
Well, the first story that I've ever wrote is called Pipes. I wrote it when I was 19. When I was in high school, I majored in math and physics, and I always loved to read, but I never thought I was going to write anything. But but during my compulsory army service, I was a horrible soldier, and I kind of kept getting into trouble, and they kind of moved me, threw me away from quite a few units. And in the end, I worked in this computer room where I had to take those very long shifts, 24 hours one or 48 hours one. And when you do that, very often you find yourself talking to yourself, And after talking to yourself, kind of writing to yourself seemed as a natural development. So I found myself writing my first stories then. Well, again, very, very much when I talked about, about the not understanding how British people can live with the weather. Actually, I look many times at diaspora Jews, and I look many times at, Jewish American writers, some of which I can call my friends, like Nathan Englander, Jonathan Safran Foer, or Gary Steingart, and I say, what do they give those Jews, that they're so funny and reflexive and smart? And I think, and I really think that, I'm very proud to be Israeli, but I actually think that it's kind of my role to try and bring some diaspora Jewish values to Israel. Because we must remember that, that the idea of Israel was thought of by Theodor Herzl. We always like in America, if there's a good fiction book, you base a movie on it, right? In Israel, when you have a good fiction book, you base a country on it. But Altneuland started as a speculative book, by Herzl. And in the book, the idea was that if you take the Jews, and bring them in a country, give them their own country, you'll accuse them from their Jewishness. That was basically the idea, because Jews couldn't practice agriculture in their countries. They were not soldiers. But if you bring them and you let them use this agriculture and become soldiers, they'll stop having all those problems that Jews had in the diaspora that cause anti-Semitism. And And I want to say that, that many times, in many senses, kind of the Israeli or the Israeli ethos is the anti-Jewish one. It's like kind of the Jews were the people of the book. We are the people of the high tech. What's the difference between book and high tech? We're pragmatic. Our leaders in the diaspora were spiritual leaders. Our leaders in Israel have military backgrounds. All of them are generals. So I really think that it's good that we have this a very strong and powerful identity and this innovativeness that I like a lot. But I don't think that we need to be cured, from our Jewishness. There are so many beautiful Jewish values that I would have loved to see more in Israel. And again, I think that let's say Jewish humor. I think Israeli literature is one of the best literatures in the world, but it doesn't have a lot of humor. It has a lot of epic sense, and the reason that it doesn't have humor is because I think that it lacks the reflexiveness that the diaspora Jews have. Because I think the diaspora Jew, by definition, has two-tier thinking. Because let's say an American Jew, walks out in the streets, see Americans do stuff, he says, "Whoa, those Americans are crazy," and he can say that as a Jew. And then he goes to synagogue and he sees people doing something weird and say, "Whoa, those Jews are crazy," and he can say that as an American. So this ability to be an insider, outsider, it's not a coincidence that Jews had invented the superheroes with a secret identity, because this was what a Jew would do: get into a phone booth, put a yarmulke on, and turn into somebody else, So I once said in an interview, and it got people really pissed, that I feel like a Jew in the diaspora of Israel. And when I wanted to say that, it wasn't that I feel that I live in a wonderful diaspora, But I feel that this idea, this feeling that whenever there are two more people with me in a room, I feel like a minority, This kind of sensation is something that I actually like and love. So I think that, there is much to be admired about Israel and Israelis, but there is much to be admired by this amazing Jewish thinking that is able to survive through generation in different countries, in a very oxymoronic ways. There are many people here who define themselves secular and Jewish. I don't know many people who define themselves Christian and secular, or Muslim and secular, And I think that, we each have a lot to learn from each other.
Yes, beautiful.
Thanks.
So I want to give a special thank you to Rabbi Gary Oren and to the AJU for this beautiful event, to Rose from IKAR, who worked very hard to make this a reality, to the amazing Lisa Edelstein. We thank you for your reading. And for you, Etgar, there's one story where you talk about a trip to Italy for a reading, and waking up in the morning and seeing this Mediterranean Sea, but from the other perspective. And you say, "I know this sea very well. It's the same Mediterranean that's only a 5-minute walk from my house in Tel Aviv. But the peace and tranquility projected by the locals here are something that I have never encountered before." And I know, it's funny, and it's also real. And I think in some ways, one of the great blessings of your voice and your presence in the Jewish and Israeli landscape is that all of these travels have introduced you to and deepened your sense of humanity. And right now, it really is the artists and it's the authors who are the voices of moral clarity in our community. And I am so grateful to you. And I hope that I know it's hard to leave your family behind. Believe me, I know. When you get on that plane and you're like, what am I doing?
I'm going to see them in New York.
Good. Okay. But I just want to
hours.
say, thank God that you are doing what you're doing in the world. Your voice really matters, and I hope that you find the strength to continue writing and creating for many, many years to come. You are a blessing.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much.